chlorines on lead release in drinking water with Mark Edwards and Janzak. However, after serving in Paraguay with the Peace Corps working with the rural community improving public health issues, he returned to the dark side of water treatment. With HRSD, he's had the opportunity to experience many aspects of wastewater treatment. He worked on a project fermenting primary biosolids with restrapped waste, exposing him to wonderful volcanic odors and making him an unofficial sludge sommelier. He continues his work focusing on dewatering biosolids with Matt Higgins at Bucknell University, identifying the mechanisms that affect dewatering with respect to IOP and thermal. So, without further ado, we have Jeff here to discuss update on the Water Research Foundation dewatering research study.
Okay, yeah, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Maba, for allowing me to present some of the work that I've done with Matt up at Bucknell. And so, this is just a survey of a number of water resource recovery facilities, as well as trying to identify what controls dewatering with respect to BioP and THP. And so I'm sure we're all familiar in this room the effect that we've seen, the phenomena of plants either changing to BioP or upgrading to BioP. The fact that, regardless, as you can see in this chart here, kind of cake solids on the y-axis and just different plants and, different dewatering processes that you see when plants change to BioP. We see a big drop, or about a 4 to 5% drop in dewatered cake solids. And then we also see an accompanying increase in polymer demand. And so at HRSD, we have a plant where we're actually doing, it's an ocean outvalve plant where we don't even need to do BioP. During one of our upgrades, they had troubles with settling in the past, so they added an anaerobic selector before a high-rate activated sludge system, which turned it into a great BioP plant that didn't need to remove any phosphorus at all. And so when they did that, they saw a big decrease. And this plant actually has on-site cake storage because we have a whole land application site that they're also doing well monitoring on. But when they switched to BioP, as you can see at our on-site cake storage site, they lost a lot of stackability. And so a lot of this research is trying to figure out what is causing this decrease in dewaterability, and then also how does THP help improve that dewaterability. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, so when we talk about dewatering, I guess we'll go to the fundamentals here and just talk about water and biosolids. And so just talking about different types of water. And so usually there's 3 types of water: free, interstitial, and flocked. And so free water is obviously, and we like to classify them by both their physical and chemical state. And so free water is obviously both physically free and chemically free. And so there's a great book by Gerald Pollack from, I believe, from the University of Washington called The Fourth Phase of Water. He also has a book called Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life. And it's all about how around proteins, around negatively charged protein sites, that water can be structured around these sites and held chemically with 2 proteins. And so that's what I mean when we say chemically bound to the flocks. And so then after free, we have interstitial water. And so this can be both physically trapped in capillaries and in between flocks, and then also in the negatively charged spaces. And so I would consider, we see a big difference going from a belt filter press to a centrifuge to a Bucher press, and with your increase in dewaterability of the same sludge. And so I think that difference that you see is the process's ability to squeeze out that interstitial water. And so is why we see a big change in that with the increased shear in each of those processes to push that out. But then ultimately, when we think of flock water, this is flock that is both physically trapped and chemically bound within the flock. And so we propose that it's the water that's trapped within the flock that cannot be removed by mechanical dewatering. This is the water that's really limiting the dewaterability of a sludge. And then going to the floc section of our biosolids, kind of just proposing a model here. Feel free to challenge this. But so starting with the bacteria, you have individual bacteria reproducing by binary fission, and then creating this tightly bound EPS. These form into microcolonies. Each individual species of bacteria form microcolonies, and they're also, there's also this other loosely bound EPS, and because most of these are hydrophobic in an aqueous environment, they all come together and form these larger flocs. And so just to talk about EPS, this is what, when we talk about tightly bound versus loosely bound versus soluble, this is kind of what we're talking about. And then going from this and then bringing in the effect of cations. This is images from another study, actually from, I believe, chemical engineering, where they're just looking at gelatin hydrogels and the effect of removing cations from these hydrogels and looking at the effect that it has. So this is just a slice of one of these hydrogels, and you can kind of see these small pore spaces. But then when they're able to remove these divalent or multivalent cations, which are able to bind the positive cations, bind these negative sites on the proteins and bring them together, when you take those out, it forms these larger pore spaces, which we believe is what both removing iron and phosphate is pulling these multivalent cations. And so the hypothesis is that we have our floc with increasing phosphorus, which you see when you go from non-BioP to BioP, as well as that binds both magnesium and calcium, pulling all of those out of the floc. And then you also have hydrogen sulfide binding a lot of your iron and pulling those out of the floc, which then creates a lot more soluble and loosely bound EPS, and then allows these sludges to bind more water or hold more water. And so we did a survey of on this plot we have 5 of the plants. Or we're showing both upper left is soluble EPS, then loosely bound EPS, and tightly bound EPS. And just a note about EPS, I hope it's not an intimidating thing. All you're really doing is taking your sludge and either heating it or sonicating it, or just mixing it up and trying to remove different parts of this floc, and then classifying each of those as soluble or loosely bound or tightly bound. And so this is just showing each type of EPS as COD as a proportion to the volatile solids measured against the dewatered cake solids. And then you can see you have primary, WAS, and then just digestate. And so we couldn't find, none of these give us a really good correlation when we're plotting them against dewatered cake solids. And so then we also wanted to look, okay, maybe if we just look at the soluble and loosely bound in the top left. Sorry, when I loaded this to this computer, I looked to have reformatted some of my graphs. But that's dewatered cake solids on the y-axis. And then we tried to see if maybe it's just the loosely bound and tightly bound, and that doesn't correlate. And then just doing total EPS, and that didn't have a correlation either. And so EPS isn't really working for us. And so then what if we just, take soluble plus loosely bound over tightly bound, as you're kind of seeing if you're shifting from the soluble, tightly bound to soluble, and that has a little bit better, but still not a good correlation. And then this loosely bound and tightly bound gives us a good correlation, but it doesn't make any actual sense, because this is saying that if you have more loosely bound EPS, it dewaters better. And really all you're seeing is that the digestate and the WAS all kind of focus on this lower point. And then all the primaries up at the upper right. And so we were just getting really frustrated with the EPS. And we were using a thermal extraction method. And so following that back all the way back to about, I think 1968 was one of the first papers where we saw kind of the British adapt it from just from looking at monocultures of E. coli and extracting EPS and then applying it to WAS. And then just looking at it go through up to today, there's really been no standardization of EPS measurements. And so because we were measuring this in COD, we were able to compare this to the total COD of each sample. And so here we have, going from the top, this is on the left is the percentage of the total COD, and then on the bottom is just primary WAS, the combined feed, and then after digestion, you see that at the top it's soluble, then loosely bound, then tightly bound, and then all of this quote-unquote non-EPS COD, which makes up a large portion of your floc. But so what we see is that EPS really isn't giving us a good picture of what is in the flocs. And so we started thinking that this isn't a good way to classify it. This isn't going to give us good data. And so then luckily, or making us think that we're not crazy, this paper came out earlier this year. I'm sure you can't read it in the back, but it's extracellular polymeric substances of biofilm suffering from an identity crisis. And one of the main lines is that the lack of information on the chemical and physical identities of EPS limits the potential to rationally engineer biofilm processes and impedes progress within the water and wastewater sector towards a circular economy and resource recovery. So it was good to kind of have our beliefs confirmed that EPS isn't really a good measure, or at least the methods aren't really a good measure. And so moving on, we started to think, what else can we use to try and have a good parameter? And so we measure CHN. And so CHN, you dry out your biosolid sample and you run your dried sample. So essentially you're evaporating all of your ammonia. And so what you would have left in the sample would maybe be some struvite and then a lot of your organic nitrogen. And so then if we plot our C to N ratio here, you see we get a really good, almost 90% correlation. Again, showing the different types of sludges, the raw, the WAS, the feed, and the digestate. And so showing that when you have more carbon and less nitrogen, you get much better dewaterability. But there really isn't a good, if you look at just the digestate, there's not a good correlation there. So then, so the x-axis on this is actually, it's a mass per mass, so it should be nitrogen per VS on a gram-to-gram basis. But you can see that this kind of gives us a little bit better of a correlation just looking at the digestate, which is in kind of the blue X's there. And it also improves our correlation a little bit more. And then if we look at total organic nitrogen, which is just your TKN minus your ammonia, and is kind of a proxy for your protein content, and is much easier to do than a total protein analysis. And so here you can see that we get about a very good correlation, and then on the bottom correlation is just for the digestate samples. And so we're still at about 0.6 looking at just digestate, but overall we have about a really good correlation with organic nitrogen. And so then we also looked at metals, and we did ICP analysis of all our samples, and then here we have just the sum of the divalent metals, but when you plot these versus dewatered cake solids, you don't see a good correlation with either of them individually or summed up. But when you normalize it to the amount of phosphorus and sulfur in the sample, you see that it provides a much better correlation, showing that phosphorus and sulfur would be binding these, and so this is essentially showing the amount of divalent or multivalent cations available to be active in the floc that aren't being precipitated in the digestate or in the sample, which we also saw when we did some aquatic chemistry analysis of these samples. But you can still see, you get a little bit better correlation within the anaerobic digestate portion. But then we combined, and so we really need to go back and do some better multivariate analysis to put these two, the metals and the protein data together to create a better model. This is kind of unsophisticatedly and brutishly put together in Excel to kind of combine these to find a good correlation. But looking at just the anaerobic digestate, we see that that the metals and the protein data, when put together, give you a really good correlation for predicting the dewaterability of anaerobic digestate, along with the other samples. Although WAS is still just kind of clustered, and we haven't really cracked that nut yet. But yeah, so we found that the protein portion is really important. And so when we think about THP really isn't going to affect your metals content very much. And so we think that THP must be having an effect on your protein content. And so now switching to look at THP, the hypothesis is that THP is able to take our floc, essentially hydrolyze and lyse a lot of those proteins, turn them into smaller pieces, which is then why you see a higher increase in polymer consumption, but they aren't able to form gels in solution. And so to investigate this, we set up 6 reactors. 3 were just run conventional mesophilic, just normal feed, 1 with primary and WAS, 1 WAS only, 1 primary only. And then we ran 3 THP reactors as well, that one with the same setup of THP and WAS, and then only primary. And then just monitored their operation and then measured their dewaterability. And so this is just our picture of our lab scale THP reactor there on the right. We have a boiler. We have about a 4-liter reactor or 5-liter reactor. It's just a batch process. You fill it from the top, heat it up to about 6 bars of pressure, heat it for about 30 minutes, let off the inert gases about every 10 minutes so it doesn't overpressure, and then flash it from the reactor portion into the flash tank, and then collect that sample. And then that sample is daily, semi-continuously fed to these 10-liter digesters on the right here. And then there we measure gas volume, gas content, and we can measure VSR, CODR, and pH and all the other necessary analysis on these samples. And so one of the big discoveries we found here is that this is looking at the effect of THP on VSR. And so and on the x-axis we have the amount of primary versus the percentage of primary to the total sample. Going from, on the left is just all WAS, and on the right is all primary, and in the middle is about a 60-40 primary WAS split. And so looking at just the lower blue markers here, we see that primary has a much higher VSR, around 56%, and then decreases down, whereas WAS has a VSR of only about 33%. But then once these samples are put through THP, we see a big jump in the dewaterability of the WAS, about 20% increase in the VSR. But with the primary, we really only see about a 4% increase. And so you get a lot, so THP is much better for increasing the degradation of WAS than it is for primary. And so I guess one of the ways that measuring EPS was helpful to us was here we have again the EPS, the EPS as COD as a percentage of the total sample. And then on the bottom, it's just going from the raw WAS to the hydrolyzed WAS, and then just regular WAS digestate and thermally hydrolyzed WAS digestate. And from the top, it's going from less than 5 kilodalton. And so we extracted the soluble EPS, and so all of this was put through molecular weight filters and then we measured COD. And so it's going from 5 kilodalton all the way up to about 5 micron. And so just looking at the two bars on the left here, you can see that you go from, it has a really big effect on the WAS, creating a big proportion of organic matter that's much less than 5 kilodalton and much less than 30 kilodalton that disappears once you go from thermally hydrolyzed WAS to the thermally hydrolyzed WAS digestate, which makes us think that a lot of this is, turned from unbiodegradable to biodegradable organic matter. And that's why you see, because it's able to turn a lot of this organic matter into much smaller components, it's able to be degraded, and that's why you see your increase. in the VSR. But of course, and I mean, it may be much bigger because we're only able in this picture to look at the soluble fraction and not what it's done to the proteins in that other part of the COD. And then looking at the same, we can see that for primary, that you don't see it as much, and that kind of explains why we don't see a big increase in the degradability of primary. That it's, yeah, so it doesn't have as big of an effect of solubilizing primary, and it's already really highly degradable, and so it doesn't have as big an effect. So then if we look at going through digestion, here we're going from, so it looks like it took away part of my markings here. So going on top, we're going from the undigested feed to the anaerobic digestate with the WAS. So this completely confounds our hypothesis that because the WAS is not responsible mostly for the big decrease in dewaterability. It's the primary on the right here that has the big drop in dewaterability going through anaerobic digestion. And so WAS, we really only see about a 1% drop in the dewatered cake solids, whereas the primary, we see a big 12% drop. And then here we're going from the undigested feed, and just going through thermal hydrolysis, we see about an increase of 15% for the WAS, 12% for the primary, but then a huge drop after digestion. And so the green triangles again are the digested feed, or the digested solids. And so we see that same big drop. And then looking at this as a TON to VS, on a TON to VS basis, you can see that just going from the conventional feed to the THP feed, that the THP does decrease the amount of organic nitrogen or protein for each of these samples and increases its dewaterability. But then going through digestion, that really increases the amount, at least for the primary and WAS, that it really increases the amount of proportion of organic nitrogen. And, but we can also see, just comparing the conventional digestate with the THP digestate, that there's about a 4% increase across the board here, going from primary to WAS, that we just see a consistent 4% increase in dewatered cake solids of the digestate. And so I'm a little low on time, so I think I'm going to go to the polymer demand slide here. So this is going from the undigested feed, in blue to the anaerobic digestate in red. So you can see that digestion has a little bit higher effect on polymer demand for WAS than it does for primary. But then once that feed is put through THP, we see a huge jump for WAS in polymer demand. And so this is your big driver, is hydrolyzing WAS. Through THP causes a big jump in polymer demand. And so this may be confusing, but I was trying to find a way to incorporate both the changes in cake solids and using the VSR so that you can compare the amount of wet cake, the amount of wet cake that you're producing, as well as, because you have so even though your cake solids drop, you also remove a lot of those solids. And so you can see here, going from your raw primary to your anaerobically digested primary, that you really don't have a big drop in the amount of wet cake that you'd be hauling out of your plant. And so anaerobic digestion really doesn't decrease the amount of wet cake that you're hauling because you have a huge drop in dewaterability. You also have an increase in your polymer demand. And then with THP, you do have a little bit more of a decrease in your wet cake, but also an increase in your polymer demand. And then here's with the same thing with WAS. You also see, but here you see that you do have a little bit bigger of a decrease in the amount of wet cake you're producing, but also a big increase in polymer demand. But then because you have a much higher VSR with THP, it reduces the amount of volatile solids, even though they have a much higher polymer demand. So there is a trade-off here between polymer demand and the amount of wet cake that you're trucking out. And of course, we're not factoring in renewable energy credits and heating your plant and gas production, and if you're able to get money from using this. And then when we combine the two, here we have just WAS and primary together, and you can see that going from just the raw to the anaerobically digested, that you're producing about the same amount of wet cake, but then you also have an increase in your polymer demand. And then also after, but then with thermal hydrolysis, you get a decrease in your wet cake, but then an increase in your polymer demand. So it's kind of a trade-off there. And so we haven't really done an economic analysis to see how it balances out, just looking at these two and kind of disregarding all the increases in gas production. But so just some take-home thoughts. The extent of the biosolids dewaterability seems to be strongly correlated with the total organic nitrogen content. The multivalent cations ratio to the phosphorus and sulfur also seems to be really important. The decrease in biosolids cake after anaerobic digestion is mostly due to the decrease in the primary biosolids and not the WAS, which is was really not what I was expecting. And then THP was able to increase the VSR of WAS, but also increase the polymer demand. And that the THP has a smaller impact on the VSR of primary, and then fortunately it doesn't increase the amount of polymer that's needed. And that also, I guess, and so THP is somehow altering the organic nitrogen of the rest of the floc particle, and that helps keeps its dewaterability about 4 percentage points above just WAS and primary, or WAS and primary combined. And thank you.
All right, we have a few questions. We have a little bit of time. Anyone for Jeff here?
So in your lab, when you, how did you emulate or do dewatering in the lab?
So this is, I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with Matt Higgins. We use this cup process where we mix polymer and solids in a baffled small 1 liter or 500 milliliter baffled reactor. And we do a whole CST curve until we get to the optimum polymer dose. And then that gives us the lowest CST. Then we take that sample, we drain it, gravity drain it, and then put about 2.5 grams of sludge, or so 2.5 grams of total solids onto the centrifuge cup, which is essentially a piece of belt filter press fabric suspended above the bottom of so the fabric's here and it's suspended above, and then we centrifuge it through a protocol that was previously researched by another student to give us a good dewatering method.
You use the same polymer for all your different sludge mixes?
So in this study we did. Normally Matt has a THP polymer and a non-THP polymer that he uses, but just so we didn't have to deal with or have the discrepancy between using two separate polymers, we just use the same THP polymer for all of them. Thank you.
Time for one more.
You talked about the economic analysis that could be done, the trade-offs in using this technology. Do you know of any studies that have kind of gone through that kind of experiment to compare a base situation with having this THP technology and how they compare? Because it's difficult to know how,
all the different trade-offs.
Right.
Yeah.
You require more polymer, you can buy more chemicals, but then you're producing more gas. So I'd like to see a study that does that analysis.
Yeah, and even now, as the economy is recovering, the competition for polymers is going up, and so the price of polymer, at least at HRSD, we're seeing that, you know, back when the economy crashed, it was great for us because we saw the price of polymer go down because there wasn't as much demand, but now that demand's going up, polymer is becoming a big concern and it's getting really expensive. I would assume that, I mean, Bill Barber's put out a great THP paper looking at all the aspects of THP. I'm not sure that was published. But I would assume that the THP manufacturers would have information on that. But I haven't seen an big, you know, whole holistic economic analysis of THP. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, we will get moving on to our next speaker. I know you already gave me your name. I'm going to